Welcome to Designs for Sharpening Leadership. Today we're going to talk about people of the Old Testament. We're going to talk about the patriarchal period. This will be the final session of the patriarchal period. We've talked about Adam and Eve and Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Today we're going to talk about Joseph and his brothers. And of course we're going to begin in Genesis chapter 37. Joseph is all of 17 years old, and his father sends him to check on his brothers. Now, in checking on his brothers, these guys are out there watching the sheep. Joseph brings back a bad report, and of course they hate him because he is always telling on them. He's the snitch, if you will. Jacob was a man that was not afraid to show favoritism, and he did show favoritism. After all, Rebekah showed him favoritism. Jacob shows favoritism to Joseph. He is the one that is the most loved of all of the brothers. He gives Joseph a coat of many colors, and he doesn't give anybody else a coat of many colors. Joseph is a dreamer. He had two dreams that he shared with his brother, and I'm not sure that they really appreciated them. The first dream was about the sheaves that were in the field. There were sheaves that rose up and bowed down to his sheaf that was in the field. In another dream, there were the sun, the moon, and the stars that all bowed down to him. His brothers and his father said, "What? Are we going to bow down to you?" And his brothers began to hate him even more for these particular dreams that he had. One day, Joseph is out in the field and he's wandering around. He's out looking for his brothers again, probably out checking on them again. And his brothers see him from a distance. They say, "You know what? We need to do something about this dreamer, about this troublemaker." They decide to grab him. When he gets there, they grab him, they threw him into a pit, and they stripped him of his coat of many colors. Reuben is there. Reuben is the oldest brother. Remember, he was the firstborn of Leah. He is there, and he tries to rescue Joseph, but he goes off to do something else. They all sit down to have dinner, and as they're sitting down, a group of nomad traders come by. And this begins to put an idea in the brothers' heads. Let's trade this guy and send him out of here. And so a group of Midianites came by. They pulled Joseph up out of the pit, and they sold him to the Midianites. Reuben returns. The boy's gone. He's furious, he's upset, and they have to now concoct some kind of a plan to fool Dad, because after all, Joseph was the favorite son. And so what they do is they take a lamb, they slaughter that lamb, and then they dip the coat in the lamb. They probably tore it up some and got it all dirty and made it look like it was done in by some wild beast. And then they took the coat back to Jacob and they said, "Would you please examine this coat and see if this belongs to your son Joseph?" And of course, Jacob did, and Jacob was heartbroken because he knew that his son was dead. In the meantime, Joseph is taken to Egypt, where he is sold into slavery to a man by the name of Potiphar. Now, we're going to come back and talk about this in just a moment. Let's scroll things up here just a little bit, and let's talk about someone else. Let's talk about Judah, the brother Judah. We find Judah, the story of Judah that we're going to share, recorded for us in Genesis chapter 38. Judah has three sons. One son's name is The second son's name is Onan. And the third son's name was Shelu. In those days, normally the father arranged the marriage for the children, and so Judah is now arranging the marriage for the oldest, and he marries her to a woman whose name is Tamar. But is an evil rascal, and so God kills him. At that time, there was the tradition that in a family, if the older brother died, then the next in line would go in to the wife of the older brother, and together they would have a child, and that child would be named after the father that died. Onan was the next in line. He went in to Tamar, and he knew that when that child was born, that child would not be his child, but would actually be named after his brother. He wasted his seed on the ground, the scripture says, and so God wasted him. There is the brother Shelu. Judah is a little uncomfortable here, and so he says, listen, Tamar, I'll tell you what. If you'll put on widow's clothes, go stay in your father's house until Shiloh grows up, then when he grows up, I'll give him to you, and everything will be okay. Then we'll have an heir here. Tamar goes home, puts on the widow's clothes, and Judah breathes a sigh of relief because he has no intention of giving Shiloh to be Tamar's husband. He may die. Tamar, on an occasion, hears that Judah comes down to her part of the country. Judah's wife has died, and so Judah's just down there visiting some friends, and Tamar takes on the costume of a prostitute. And she's waiting for Judah to come by, and as Judah comes by, she lures him in. But there's one problem. Judah doesn't have any ready available cash on him. He left his MasterCard or Visa or American Express, or excuse me, the Canaan Express card at home. And so he pays her by a promise. He leaves her his staff, his cords, and his seal. He says, here's what we'll do. Tomorrow, I'll send a guy back with a lamb, and you can have the lamb, and you'll return my staff, my cords, and my seal. Okay, that was great. However, when Tamar leaves, she puts back on her widow's clothes. She takes the staff, the cords, and the seal, and she hides. Judah now has egg on his face because he can't find his staff, his cords, and his seal. And he just kind of hushes everything up. But 3 months later, Tamar is found to be with child. And so they bring her out because, after all, she's a widow. That she's committed fornication here. Tamar says, listen, before you kill me, I want you to know that I am with child by the man that owns the staff, the cords, and the seal. Judah says, oh, those are mine. And he realizes that Tamar is more righteous than he is. From that relationship between Judah and Tamar, 2 children are born, twins, Perez and Zerah. And I would encourage you, please, to go back and read Genesis 38, because what God is doing here is he's using this situation to begin to set up the kingdom. Remember, God's purpose is to bring people back to himself through Jesus Christ. Judah will be the tribe, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute, that God will use to bring about the birth of the Christ child, Tamar and Judah. Let's turn the page and go back to Egypt, where we find Joseph. So now we have Joseph in Egypt, and let's talk about him for just a little bit. Joseph in Egypt. When he gets to Egypt, according to Genesis chapter 39, verse 2, the scripture says, and the Lord was with Joseph, so he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. He belonged to a man whose name was Potiphar. And Joseph was a man that was a great manager. And so he managed Potiphar's house quite well. In fact, Potiphar made him the second ruler of the house next to him. He left everything. He trusted Joseph to do everything. Now, we know that Joseph was a very good-looking young man. In Genesis chapter 39, Potiphar's wife begins to make some moves on Joseph. She begins to flirt with him. She begins to suggest some things to him. And eventually she says, come and lie with me. Let's have some fun. In Genesis chapter 39, verses 8 and 9, Joseph says, no, I can't do this. My master's put me in charge of everything but you. You're off limits. In verse number 9, Joseph asks a question. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God? I want you to note something here. I want you to note that Joseph was worried about sin against God. Remember when Jacob tricked Isaac? He was only worried about being caught. What happens if I get caught? Joseph was concerned about his relationship with God. On another occasion, she tries to seduce him, and it doesn't work. He runs out of the house, and on his way out, she grabs his coat and rips his coat off of him. This guy is always losing his coat. But this time, it's really disaster, because when her husband comes home, she says, you know that guy you brought in? He tried to rape me today. Here's his coat. What are you doing here? Potiphar, without checking things out, or maybe he did check things out, and he can't go against his wife's word, throws Joseph into jail. God is not done with Joseph yet. In Genesis 39, verse 21, the scripture says, "But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer." In fact, we have Joseph being put in charge of the jail. And then there's Genesis chapter 40, where Joseph begins to deal with dreams again. Only this time, Joseph isn't having the dreams. There were the cupbearer. He was the guy that would serve wine to the king. And there was the baker. And they had displeased Pharaoh in some way, we're not sure how, but both of them have a dream, and they bring their dreams to Joseph. He noticed that they're sad, and so he says, "Tell me your dream." And the cupbearer tells him his dream, and Joseph says, "Aha, you're going to be restored in a few days." And the baker says, "Well, here's my dream." And the baker tells him his dream, and Joseph says, "I'm sorry, but you're going to be hanged by the neck in a few days." He says to the cupbearer, "Listen, don't forget me." But 2 years later, 2 years later, Joseph is still in prison. The cupbearer has been restored. The baker has been hanged by his neck. Pharaoh has some dreams in Genesis chapter 41. In Pharaoh's dreams, there are 7 cows that come out of the Nile River, and they're good-looking cows, but there are 7 bad cows that eat the 7 good cows, and the bad cows still look bad. And then there was another dream. There were 7 good ears of corn, and they were eaten by 7 bad ears of corn, and the bad ears still looked bad. So no one could interpret these 2 dreams. The cupbearer says, "Pharaoh, begging your pardon, but I remember there was a guy that interpreted a dream for me in prison, and I think that he might be able to help you." And so they brought Joseph in from prison, and Joseph listened to the dreams, and Joseph interpreted the dreams. He said, "Pharaoh, this is ordained by God because the 2 dreams are actually one dream. It's a double dream in one dream. Pharaoh, here's what's going to happen. You're going to have 7 years of plenty, abundance, and you're going to have 7 years of bad, famine. And the 7 bad years are going to eat up everything that was produced in the 7 good years. And so you need to find a man that can manage the country and prepare for this disastrous famine." Pharaoh says, "Well, listen, you shared this with me, so I'm putting you in charge." I find it interesting that Joseph was 30 years old at this time. He had been a slave and in prison for 13 years, waiting. We become impatient waiting for God at times. So Joseph is brought in. He's made second in command, and he actually saves the country of Egypt between the good years and the bad years. Now, while Joseph is there, 2 sons are born to him. One son's name is Manasseh, and the other son's name is Ephraim. Now, you will recall that names mean things, and so Manasseh meant this: "God made me forget my troubles and my father's household." Ephraim's name meant, "God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction." Joseph is now in charge. He's got a family. Things are really moving for Joseph, but things are about to change for Joseph again. In Genesis chapter 42, things take another turn for Joseph. Let's go to Genesis chapter 42, and I would encourage you to go back and read these passages of Scripture. The brothers of Joseph are still living in Canaan. There's a famine there. Jacob sends them down to Egypt to get food, and while they are in Egypt getting food, they meet Joseph. Now, Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him, and so he begins to engage them in conversation, and they tell him, "We were 12 brothers, but one is gone. One is at home with dad. The baby of the family is at home with dad, and us 10 brothers are down here getting some food." Joseph says, "Oh no, you are spies. I know that you are spies." No, we're not spies. And he's testing them. He's got a plan. He says, "Well, I'll tell you what, if you're not spies, prove it. I'm going to keep one of you." And he chose Simeon. And he says, "Simeon is staying with me." if you want more food, then you bring back the little brother and prove to me that you're not spies. And so they return to Jacob. Jacob is, of course, distraught. He just lost another son. They said, well, we're eventually going to have to go back and get more food. Jacob says, oh, no, 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 you're not going to do that because I'm not turning loose of Benjamin. But then in Genesis 43 through 45, that is exactly what happens because the brothers return to Egypt. But this time they return with Benjamin. And when Joseph sees Benjamin, he is tearful. Joseph now knows that they're willing to risk Benjamin. He's got all of the brothers there. He feeds them a banquet, and he lines them all up from the youngest to the oldest. He gives Benjamin a larger, much larger portion than anyone else. And then he sends them on their way back to Canaan. However, what he does is he takes his cup of divination and sticks it in Benjamin's sack, and he sends them on their way. About a day or so later, he says to his guards, listen, you chase after those guys, and you stop them, and you tell them that they stole my cup of divination. Guards did exactly that. They stopped the 11 brothers, and they said, one of you stole the cup. And they said, no, 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 no. Everyone lowers their sacks. The cup is found to be in the sack of Benjamin. Not good. Not good at all. So they all go back. Joseph says, Benjamin will be my slave. The rest of you can go. But he's going to be my slave. And so they beg and they plead. And eventually he says, my name is Joseph. And he reveals himself to them. And then in Genesis chapter 46, the brothers go back and they tell their father, and everyone comes down to Egypt so that Joseph can care for them. And so in Genesis 46 through 49, we now have Jacob coming to Egypt. In Genesis chapter 49, Jacob calls all of his sons together, and he says, all right, it's time for me to die. I'm going to bless you. Remember that the firstborn gets the right of inheritance. He gets a double blessing. And the firstborn here is Reuben. However, Jacob says, Reuben, I'm not going to bless you with a double blessing. Remember, back in Genesis 35:22, the scripture talks about Reuben going up to Bilhah. Remember, Bilhah was the handmaid of Rachel. Rachel gave Bilhah to Jacob as a wife. Reuben goes up to Bilhah and has a sexual liaison with her. Jacob says, I'm sorry, but you cannot be the heir. Next in line was Simeon. But Simeon is linked with Levi. And we read about this in Genesis 34, 25, and 26. When Israel came into the land of Canaan, Dinah went out to greet the people, being the socialite that she was, and she was raped by Shechem. In retaliation, these two boys, Simeon and Levi, go in to the Shechemites in Genesis 34, verses 25 and 26, and they massacre the Shechemites. Jacob said, no, no, you went way beyond what you were supposed to have done. And so this, of course, brings us to Judah. And Judah becomes the ruler of the tribes of Israel. Now, what we want to do is focus on Genesis 49:10. The scripture says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. God is setting up Judah to be the one through whom the Christ child will be born. Remember God's plan, his goal, the thread through the entire Bible. God is bringing people back to himself through Jesus Christ. And so God is going to bless Judah, and Judah will be the one that will bring forth the Christ child. In Genesis chapter 50, Jacob will die. They take Jacob's body back to Canaan, where they bury him, and then they all come back to Egypt. Now the 9 brothers are saying, this will give Joseph an opportunity to really get even with us. And so they concoct the story. They come to to Joseph and they say, listen, while Dad was alive, he wanted you to forgive us for what we did to you. I want you to note Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. And as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. In Canaan, they would have probably died, but in Egypt, God was protecting them. God works all things together for good to those that love him. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. God's timing is not always our timing. Eventually, all of the brothers die, and Joseph is embalmed, and when Moses leaves the land of Canaan, then they will take the body of Joseph back and bury it in the land of Canaan. I want to leave you with one passage of scripture this morning, Psalm 119, verse 24. The scripture says, your testimonies also are my delight. They are my counselors. The scriptures are our counselors. We should find happiness and joy and delight in reading and studying the scriptures because they show us the direction that we should take in our life. Today, I hope that you will go back and read the book of Genesis. Read about the lives of these people. This is George Corrales for Designs for Sharpening Leaderships. God bless you today.